Hello, and welcome to Derek Discusses. In today's segment, we are going to be focusing on an oft misunderstood and criticized idea in the psychological world known as catharsis. So I understand some of you may or may not currently know what catharsis is or means. So we are going to start with a little bit of a background on the topic. Firstly, catharsis ultimately derives from the Greek word which can be translated as cleansing or purification. So at its base, catharsis is basically a way of just that, cleansing or purifying yourself, or at least an attempt to do so. Many famous psychologists have thought up their own specific definitions of the word, some quite similar, and some very much different from others. Just to name a few, we have Aristotle, stating that catharsis is a purging of the spirit of morbid and base ideas or emotions by witnessing the playing out of such emotions or ideas on stage. Breuer and Freud described catharsis as an involuntary, instinctive body process such as crying. Schultz and Schultz take a more psychodynamic approach to their definition of the term in saying that catharsis is the process of reducing or eliminating a complex by recalling it to conscious awareness and allowing it to be expressed. And finally, we have the American Psychological Association's sort of official definition of the term, stating that catharsis is the discharge of effects connected to traumatic events that had previously been repressed by bringing these events back into consciousness and re-experiencing them. So as you can see, we have a great many differing viewpoints on the distinct meaning and effect of catharsis from various points in history. Today I would like to discuss catharsis in a little bit further detail in an attempt to understand these different viewpoints on catharsis and hopefully choose a definition we find to be the most accurate representation of the topic. We will begin by delving into Aristotle's view on catharsis in a little bit more detail. By far, Aristotle's definition of catharsis is more peculiar than any of the others, mainly in one distinct aspect. Aristotle's view on catharsis not as completely personal experience, but rather something a person experiences specifically when watching a play, specifically a tragedy acted out. This is overall a quite interesting take on catharsis, as it basically means that by watching a similar tragic event to something that we have experienced in our own lives, that we can relate to the play so deeply that we can experience cathartic releases as if it was us ourselves experiencing the tragedy in the play. A psychologist by the name of Sheff also believes in this notion to some extent. Sheff talks about catharsis as an emotional, somatic discharge and cognitive awareness, an idea he coins as distancing. Basically, what he means by this is that when a person experiences catharsis by being the observer rather than the participant, it allows the person to experience a much greater sense of control and full alertness of their environment. Overall, Aristotle's view of catharsis through means of watching tragedy as a way to restore harmony and produce a wise and reasonable man. Now we will move on to a very important time in history relating to cathartic thinkings. Around the time of the 1890s, Freud and Breuer officially brought the idea of cathartic therapy into the light of modern psychology. Using the cathartic therapy as a therapeutic method, Freud and Breuer mainly used the concept of hypnosis to recover repressed memories in patients of negative traumatic events that have occurred to them in the past. Through many tests on various different subjects, all experiencing very different forms of traumatic events, Freud and Breuer observed that each individual's hysterical symptoms immediately, permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked and in arousing its accompanying effect. Freud, in 1893, said those exact words. Later on in Freud's work, he actually rejected his work and thoughts on the use of hypnotic and cathartic means and of therapy, and instead focused more heavily on the insight aspect of therapy, thus developing psychoanalysis as a result. One of the interesting ways I think catharsis comes into light today in our modern society is in the concept of violent video games and the ever-present concern that playing these video games make children more violent as a result, and more likely to commit acts found within the games in real life. While this very well could be true, it is important that we consider multiple different viewpoints on the subject. First and foremost, it is imperative that we discuss the chicken or the egg scenario with regards to violent video games. It very well could be that children being violent in everyday behavior is correlated with these children playing violent video games. But it could very well also be the exact opposite. By this I mean that by having more violent tendencies and personalities, these children are more likely to play and enjoy violent video games. Regardless of what you think is true, I think that some cases people have violent tendencies could very well use violent video games as a form of cathartic therapy, much in the same way that Aristotle views using tragic plays. Sort of like an interactive and self-driven 21st century play, video games allow violent people to express their emotions and take part in violent acts without actually putting anyone else or themselves in harm. By experiencing these things within a video game, it goes to say by the concept of Aristotelic catharsis that these people could thereby relieve and alleviate the feelings related to these violent tendencies. Traditionally, for the most part, catharsis has been perceived as a sort of healing experience. Although lately, current research tends to bring contradicting data to the table, possibly disproving that assumption. Many modern-day psychologists and researchers have gone on record challenging the previous thought of healing catharsis. Bushman claims that venting anger does in fact not help to reduce anger and shouldn't be used in therapy. Gemmer, in 2006, believes that traumatic experience, if repeatedly relived in catharsis, can actually be relearned and become more harmful. Bohart also presents a thought that catharsis actually does more harm than good by demonstrating that expression of anger does not produce any sort of relief or anger reduction and actually increases the tendencies. Sheff, however, goes against these thoughts and states that it is imperative to the effectiveness of catharsis in therapy that the participant appropriately balances the past distress and feelings of safety and support in the present. Back to his concept of distancing, it is important to achieve the proper optimum distancing from the traumatic event. Sheff mainly argues that in cases of major repressed traumatic events, verbal recall alone is not sufficient for a permanent positive therapeutic change. In short, catharsis and its use in psychotherapy should generally not be confused with isolated emotional discharge techniques such as venting anger. These are very different concepts and practices and should not be used interchangeably. Catharsis refers to the re-experiencing of significant traumatic events that have not been fully emotionally processed, and they are causing emotional, physical, or relationship problems in someone's life. So, now that we have a little bit more of a solid understanding of catharsis, in history as well as a more modern take on this subject, what do you feel is the correct definition of catharsis? Do you think Aristotle has it right? Or maybe the more general and psychodynamic thoughts of Schultz and Schultz have it correct? Personally, I think that Aristotle's definition absolutely holds water, just that it is more of a part to a bigger whole, and not entirely the sole definition. I think that Schultz and Schultz add a little bit more to the general term of catharsis, and the official psychological definition touches on this subject. Do you think catharsis is an effective therapy technique? Or do you think it could do more harm than good? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to check out the next episode of Derek Discusses.